you who have not met me, my name is Clark Chambers. I'm located out of Huntsville, Alabama. I'm currently a gameplay programmer with the Lost Boys Interactive, a studio located out of Madison, Wisconsin and Austin, Texas, and am formerly part of the U.S. Army Game Studio. And I love birds and baking. But that's not what I'm talking about today. I am talking about editing text. To be clear, this is not a presentation about any particular algorithms or technical details. This is solely going to be a talk about the simple act of putting text into a buffer. Now, editing text, as we all know, simply is just placing characters to where a cursor is. In the scope of programming, this is accomplished with, once again, obviously, a keyboard, a mouse, and software tools. I'm going to be focusing on the latter for now, because I'm assuming that we already know how to use a keyboard and a mouse. And we do this every single day we program. But why give a talk on it? It's deceptively simple. It's something we do every day, but there are problems that arise when we do it. And not problems with simple solutions, and not problems that we've always had the tools to solve. These challenges, these problems that namely arise while we're editing text are navigation, where we want to get from point A to point B, selection, where we want to tell a particular text editor what we are going to be editing, the actual editing itself, I mean the bread and butter, the one we're all familiar with as programmers, typing things into the screen. But the first two aren't really taught. They're pretty neglected by education. Through all of my experience with formal education, working with employers, and even listening to dozens and hundreds of talks from GDC and other programming related conferences, I haven't heard people talk about the act of editing text, specifically with navigation and selection. And when not taught to solve these challenges, engineers will learn their own slow, though suitable solutions. They'll solve the problems, but they won't solve them very fast. And as I'm sure we know, speed is key when developing games. And addressing these challenges can save hundreds upon hundreds of hours per engineer per year. Because whenever we have an idea in our head as programmers, something that we want to see exist either as a part of a system or in game, there's an inherent time friction that shows up where we know what we want to exist, but there's time between when we conceive that idea and when it actually shows up. And I want to provide a small, simple framework for reducing this friction, where I can show examples of these problems and how I tend to solve them, and start getting people thinking about how they can solve them in their own environment. But why go fast? Well, production is temporal. The faster we can iterate, then the faster we can make games. And the more faster we can make games, the more games we can make through our lifetime. And not only that, the faster we can iterate, the better those games get. The quicker we're able to see these ideas manifest in our code. Now let's talk a little bit about the challenge domains that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to be focusing on these three. This is how I usually think about my editing. Navigation, which is I as the programmer want to get from point A to point B. This is where I find there's the least amount of education. And this is the most important time saver, where you will be leaps and bounds faster, reducing time friction in this area. There's selection, where you're telling your text editor, this is what I want to change. There's a lot of small little tricks and ideas you can come up with here that'll save time, and they'll add up as you come up with them. And then there's editing, which is just, I want this to become something different. My current selection, do something to it. And this is the one we all know and love. This is, you're typing into a keyboard and everything is great. Now, most challenges that we come across while editing text are unions of these. They're composed of these elements, but we're going to start by breaking them down one by one and then taking an example that uses all three of them to solve it. Now, the tools that we use to solve them are Humble Text Editor. For this talk, I'll be using Visual Studio Code and C#. Visual Studio Code primarily because it's the most popular text editor out there and the one I use daily. C# because it's a very simple language and one that's fairly common, and I would have picked C++, but I don't want to be swapping around between header files and implementation. But any fully featured text editor will be able to solve these problems that I'm displaying today. Some examples are Sublime Text, Vim, Atom. Visual Studio is suitable, but some of the tools we will discuss are absent from the text editor without paid extensions. I'll mention those if you're really attached to Visual Studio, but it's a little bit less flexible when it comes to editing text. And here's the tools I use to solve them. Once again, Visual Studio Code, C#. And while I'm walking through these, I want you to start thinking about the problems that you experience in your own environment. And I might get a little rambly doing so. Feel free to stop me and ask questions. But the solutions that you come up with might look different depending on where you are, especially if you're using something like Vim or Emacs. I'm going to start with navigation, because this is the big one, and the first couple things I'm going to talk about are where you're going to save a whole lot of time. And I'm going to focus on 3 parts of navigation. I'm going to focus on project navigation, where you're moving between files or moving to and from definitions. I'm going to talk a little bit about file navigation, where you're moving around inside of a particular file, whether that be to functions, variables, lines, etc. And I'm going to be talking about line navigation, where you're at a particular line and you want to move around to different subsections of that line. And with this, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my text editor and start working through some examples. Now, if this is coming through all right, you should see Visual Studio Code with the text panel on the right and the project panel on the left. And we are going to pretend that we are a new user to this project and really want to know how it works. Now here we are in our program.cs, and this is our main function. And we see a few things here. We see some code and some future examples, but for now we're going to be focusing right here. We have this object named navigation examples, and we're creating a new instance of it. Now, as a new user of this project, I want to know where this navigation examples exists. Now, let's think about what we know for a second. We know that we're in program.cs, and we know that there is an object called navigation examples. Naturally, we can come over to the left and look through the project structure and see that there is a navigation examples.cs. So we say, okay, well, let's double click here and let's navigate to that file. This is the simplest project navigation, but it's a little bit slow for a couple reasons. First and foremost, you have to remove your hands from the keyboard, which is where you're doing the typing, to the mouse, and then you have to navigate that mouse from one location to another location, when in reality, all you need to know from program.cs is I want to be in a file that's probably named navigation examples. Another potential faster solution is using a wonderful tool in Visual Studio Code called the Quick Open function. If you press Control-P by default, you will be met with this wonderful little search window, which has a list of files underneath and a field where you can filter those files by name. So we know that we want to go to navigation examples, so we can just type that in, and easy as pie, that is the first result that shows up. Even if we don't spell it quite right, let's just do NV, it'll get it. It's close enough. And we press enter, and we're there. And there are a couple advantages of this. One, you don't need to know where the file is, because as games get larger, and as you start including libraries, things start to get a little messy. If we swap back over to program.cs and delete a couple of these commented lines, I'm sorry for all the right arrow spam, we'll be met with another example where we want to explore various parts of the code base. Here we are declaring some sort of string that is part of some JSON library in some string utils class, and we're just going to call toSnakeCase, but we're not sure if it functions correctly, so we want to find it. Let's start with the method that we did first, where we go over to the left on the project panel. We drop down some JSON, well, I guess it's down there in the library in the folder, And we have to navigate all the way there using many clicks and we have to be aware of where exactly in the file structure it could exist. And it will get us there. It will get us to the string utilities, but it won't do it very fast. Now compare that to the alternative, which is using the quick search, and we can get this pretty fast. We can press Control P, type ST, and that'll bring us right to the string utilities almost immediately. However, any text editor that's worth their weight in salt knows A, all the files in your project so you can navigate between them, and B, a little bit about the structure of your code. Because in the same way that we can navigate to files, we can navigate directly to definitions. Because we know what the object that defines this function is, but we also know what the function is, and we know exactly that that is a single function. So why can't we just go to the definition? Well, fortunately, in Visual Studio Code, that is very simple. You can just either right-click and go directly to the definition, and it'll take you right there, so you don't have to navigate the file. Or you can bind that to a particular key. I have Control-Alt-D as mine, and it will take you directly there, easy as pie. Now, those are by far the quickest speed-ups that you will find in project navigation. There are other problems you'll bump into, but those, if you remember those two things, will save you dozens upon dozens of hours. It is profound. But once we're in a file, we'll need to know how to navigate inside of that. Because though using a mouse is functional enough, it won't get you exactly where you need to be as quickly as keeping your hands on a keyboard. Now let's say we open up the navigation examples and we're over at line 1 and we decide, hello, I want to change this important function. I want to just delete all of it, delete line 11. There are a couple ways we could do that. Now we know that our text editor is aware of the structure of our code, and we know that it can go to definitions, but right here, we don't really have a quick path to just take us from a usage to the definition, but we do have a couple little code grappling hooks that we can use. Much in the same way that we can navigate to files, we can navigate to symbols. We know that important function is a symbol, so we can press Control R instead of Control P, and that'll bring us the same kind of navigation window, but instead of files, we can go to symbols. So we can start typing in important function, and just like that, we are immediately at the definition. This is wonderful for many, many things. If you're in the flow of it and you don't want to move your hands from the keyboard, you can just go to most symbol definitions. But you can also go to direct line definitions. If I want to go to line 22, per se, where there is a sum string becoming a string, I can just easily press Control-G to bring up the same panel for line numbers explicitly and type 22. That one's a little less useful, but it is helpful in a lot of situations. And that's usually how you can grappling hook your way around a particular file. But once you're at a particular line and you want to start moving your cursor to the location you want to select or edit or whatever, you have some tools at your disposal. You can move to the end of the line, whether that be the default keybind, which is end. I currently have that bound to Control-Alt-Right and left. You can move between words by holding Control and pressing left and right. This will allow you to move to the end or beginning of particular words. And you can even move between subwords. Let's say we're looking at this particular variable with a pretty long name, but it's the wrong name at the end. Well, we can just very quickly Control-Right to the end of that name, rename it. But we don't want to press left and right a whole bunch to get to where we need to be. We want to very quickly navigate to where we need to be. We can hold Alt and left and right, and that will navigate us between subwords, so we can very quickly pick up a particular word, change it up, and be back off to the races. A couple less important navigation techniques that you'll bump into sometimes are navigating to the begin and end of scope. You can see with the cursor on line 29 right here, if I press Control-M, it will navigate to the end and beginning of a scope. You can see it go back and forth right there. And if I navigate to the back of a line and highlight a parenthesis, if I press Control M, it will go to the start and end of those parentheticals. And those are the main tools and problems that I have personally run into with navigation. But as you start to think about how you want to be in a space in code, try to imagine an ideal solution to get there and see if your environment supports that. Because if it does, it will save you so much time. Next, I'm going to move on to selection. This is usually the workhorse of my workflow, and they involve, for the most part, multi-line editing, which is a tool that allows you to write code on multiple lines at once, symbol selection, which allows you to latch onto functions, variables, and select things in bulk very quickly, and selection expansion, which is a nice little catch-all tool to expand and contract your particular selection. This isn't going to be as massive and a game changer as the navigation examples that I've shown above, but you can leverage these tools to see many small speed increases that will add up over time. So I'm going to swap back to my text editor and pull up some of those selection examples. We'll pull up Control P and navigate to selection, navigate to that file right here, and we will be met with a set of examples once more. Now, the first tool in selection, and by far my favorite addition to any text editor in the past decade, is multi-line editing. Traditionally, when we write code, we have a single cursor and we type a whole bunch of stuff into the screen and it just shows up. However, here is a situation between line 7 and 10 where I'm currently using console.write instead of console.writeLine, and I want to refactor the code to say line instead of write. Now, this is something that I need to do regardless of how poorly this code is designed 4 times. I need to write line in each of these lines of code. That's multiplicative because what I really want to do is write the word line in 4 places. Multi-line editing allows us a very simple tool that we can use to reduce this multiplicative work down to a single operation. In Visual Studio Code, to do this, you can press Control and click in a particular location if you would rather use the mouse. You can press Control-Alt down and up to place multiple cursors on subsequent lines. Or you can just hold down middle click and drag and give yourself a nice little column of lines. Now, once you have selected multiple lines, you can type in anything and it will show up on all lines at once. So in this example, I can just type line and I'm finished with the refactor. This is wonderful, once again, because it takes these multiplicative workloads that we sometimes have to do as programmers and boils them down into a single operation. Now, the next tool that I'm going to be talking about plays really, really nice with multi-line editing, and that is the tool that I call symbol selection. In Visual Studio Code, if you have your cursor over a particular symbol, in this example being a name, if you press Control-D, it will highlight that symbol. And as you can see, every subsequent thing that matches that symbol will be highlighted as well. So for this function, where we have a variable with a bad name and we want to give it a good name, we can instead press Control-D to highlight the entire symbol, delete, and then give it a good name. And everybody is happy. In the same way, we can press Control-D and copy the name, and then move over here and Control-D to replace the name on this line. Now, as I've said, this plays very, very nice with multi-line editing because in Visual Studio Code, and I believe this is the same in Sublime Text, if you select a pattern or a symbol with Control-D, with these highlighted symbols, if you can press Control-D subsequent times, it will highlight the next symbol that matches the pattern you've given it, and will continue to do so until you run out of patterns. Now, this could be accomplished with a find and replace, But if you're working with a large file, sometimes you don't want to rename all of the symbols that match a particular pattern. Sometimes you want to keep that local, because the point of selection is to have clear tools to indicate to your text editor what exactly you want to change. So now that we have these selected, we can just delete and take this multiplicative refactor that we would have had to do otherwise and just change it to good name, easy as pie. Now, if your symbol in this example doesn't quite match all of the symbols, like we have a string, an int, a float, and a double, and we're printing all of them, but we have these mean names, these nasty names that we don't want. We want nice names. If we press Control D right here, it'll select both of the string variables, but it will not select the integer variables. However, you're not constrained to selecting whole symbols. You can select sub-symbols. Now, using our line navigation, we can press Alt-Left to go over to the mean word. We can select it just by simply using Shift. And as you can see, that symbol will be highlighted. Mean will be highlighted to indicate that it matches the pattern we've given it. So now we can press Control D, and as you see, that will just drop cursors on every subsequent line. And then we can refactor, once again, this multiplicative work by a single operation. One other small tool that's worth mentioning is selecting more or less of a particular selection. If you're not quite sure how to grow or shrink your particular selection, you can just use the select more or select operation in Visual Studio Code. I currently have those bound to a disgusting keybind, Control Shift Alt up or down to select more or less. But when you're doing this, if you have a word selected, it'll select the symbol, and then the line, and then the line in the white space, and then the scope, and then the for loop, and then the if statement, and all the way out to the function, and then the class, and then the entire file itself. And if you press down a few times, you will be right back where you started. Not the most practical tool, but it's a really nice way to just experiment with selection. Now, once you have your selection, once you've indicated to the text editor what you want to change, you're going to want to actually do the editing. I'm not going to belabor this one as much as I do the other two, mostly because we're pretty familiar with it. But I do have a couple examples that are useful. Mostly multi-line writing, which is actually writing on multiple lines at once. You can do some pretty spicy things there. There are code snippets, which are just pre-canned boilerplate that a lot of text editors come with. They're not the tool that I use the most, but I know a lot of people use them to great effect. And then there's extensions and other macros. If there's a really niche editing that you want to do that isn't baked into your text editor already, someone has likely found a solution, and a good solution, and has solved it for you, and you can install it in a blink of an eye. So let's go back to this text editor and pull out some more examples. Now, on line 7 to line 10, we have a few variables. And much in the theme of the rest of the code base, we are just going to define variables and print them out. However, there's no code that's been written here, but the code that we need to write is multiplicative. It is console.writeLine with the variable we care about. So just to recap, we are currently working on a function where we have these 4 variables, and we're just going to print them out. However, the printing operation is multiplicative. So what we're going to do is we're going to move into the meat of this. We're going to drop a cursor, because we know we can do that. We know that we can edit multiple lines at once, and we know that we can select multiple symbols, because if we press Control D, given that there's a cursor at each one of those lines, it will select automatically all the words that we care about, just because each of those cursors is individually on that symbol. So now we can copy this out. We can move down to line 13, and we can start writing some easy code. Let's paste this out here, give ourselves a nice little block of code to work with. Let's go to the beginning, drop some more in multiple lines. Let's tab that out just so it looks really nice. And now that we're here, we have all of the differences that we would have written otherwise, and we can just write the meaningful code once instead of the 4 times we would have had to otherwise. So we can just quickly console.write line. Now we do want to get to the end of the line to drop a parentheses. Now you can notice that all of these are different lengths, so we can't just hold the right arrow, otherwise this will overflow and go to a different line, and that's not what we want. So what we want is to give it a command, Control Right, that will just go to the end of the symbol for each of those lines individually. And then we can drop off a parenthesis, semicolon, and we are done. Now code snippets. These are something that I use very infrequently, but if there is an operation that I am very comfortable with and don't want to write a whole bunch of symbols, like a for loop that just iterates over an index, we can just type for. Visual Studio Code will try very hard to figure out what we mean. And down at the bottom, just because I have it configured at the bottom, we can find this little box with a dashed line underneath it that is a code snippet. And when we press Tab, this will break out the code snippet, put all the boilerplate right there, and then drop a cursor on each of the symbols that we need to change, which for us is just the iterator variable name. So we can say index, and we are done with this code snippet. There's also extensions that you can use. Here, on line 30, we have a very strange niche scenario where we want each of these variables, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now this is not a difficult operation. You can just edit them easy as pie to the names that you want, but if your list is long enough and your enumeration is heavy enough, maybe you have 100 entries or something that you need to iterate through. I'm sure especially people who have worked with legacy code bases have run into similar issues, but there is a wonderful extension that will solve this for us. It's called Text Pastry, and it will just take multiple lines and iterate over them, dropping the iterator at each of the lines. This is a simple free extension, and you can access it after installing it through the command prompt, much in the same way that we can search for files, symbols. We can also search for commands, like syncing a Git repository, like deleting a file, creating new files. There's a lot to go into here, but I won't belabor it very much. But we can say text pastry, go from 0 to x, and that will take this niche operation that we would have had to figure out how to do through editing and boiled it down to a single command. And that is drop 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on each of our variables. Now these are all wonderful little tools, but as I've said at the start, a lot of these problems that we run into are combinations of these challenge domains. And a lot of the times we have to put them together in creative ways. You may have started to see that when I was working on the editing examples, but I wanted to go through a full example of something that I run into all the time, where all of these tools combined make my life trivial and fast. And make sure when you're running into problems as you work on your own code, to leverage as many of the tools that you can and to optimize the process that you have for writing code, much like you would optimize the code yourself. Because I'm sure we all know the time that we have as developers is very, very critical. And don't be afraid to experiment. So let's drop back over to the text editor, close out of all of this. Sure, we'll save. And pull up the last file, putting it all together. Now in this example, we have a few things. We have a class and an enum and a function. Now I want this function as a developer to return some sort of enumerated string that is just the enum type with a smiley face at the end. Ignore that this is C# and you can do that easily anyways. Once again, design is not the problem here, editing is. So I want to define a switch statement. Well, I know for each of these entries, I'm going to need a case, and that is multiplicative work. So how can I break this down into all of its components? Well, first, without touching the mouse, because I'm going to try to get a little spicy here, I want to navigate to the enum example, so I can select all of those cases. Let's press Control-R, our symbol navigation, and let's go to our enum example and putting it together. You can see it highlighted right there. Now that our cursor is here, you can see it hanging out. we can select this scope with select more or select less. So I'm going to go ahead and do Control-Alt-Shift-Up, my apologies for the keybind, and copy this. Because with this text, we can start making a multiplicative operation linear. Now that we have this, we can go back on down to line 17, where we know we're going to want to start editing, and paste all of these enum cases. Now this isn't the cleanest text that we have right here, so we can go ahead and drop a couple cursors, clean it up a little bit, and start writing our important little case statement. Now, I'm going to do tab out, we'll say case enum example.a, colon, let's make a smiley face, and, well, we need the name of the enum, but we don't really have that in the paste buffer right now. We have some messy text. So let's go over here. Let's select, just using shift and left arrow, ABCD, copy it, go back, and paste it right on in, because each of the text buffers for these cursors is individual. And now that we have the multiplicative operation done, we can go back over here, define the rest of the switch statement with our enum example variable. Make sure to spell switch correctly. Add some squiggly braces. And then, well, we can just move this down over here. Easy as pie. Oh, but we forgot to return the string, so we're going to need to go and re-edit that, but we don't want to type it in once again. So we can either go over here and navigate and press Control up and Control down to make a new selection, or we can use what we have right here next to ourselves, so we don't have to navigate, by pressing Control D to highlight case, and using this symbol as a nice little grapple hook to make new cursors. Pressing Control D a few more times, using Control right to navigate where we need to be, and just typing return. And just like that, we have created a function relatively quickly. I was going a little slow here, without the need to remove our hands from the keyboard to touch the mouse, using very quick operations. Now, once again, these examples that I've shown you today, you might not choose to solve them in that way, and that's perfectly okay. Experiment in your own environments. Some examples are Visual Studio Code, which I've been using today. The Visual Studio Code documentation goes into a lot of what I've discussed and all of the additional tools that I've neglected to mention. There's Sublime Text, which is very similar to VS Code, but a little bit faster with not many extensions. There's Vim, which is a whole other can of worms that chooses to solve these problems in a little bit of a different way. And there's Visual Assist, which is a paid extension for Visual Studio that allows you to do a lot of the navigation that we've just done. Visual Studio is okay at doing this on its own, but it's not nearly as ergonomic as using Visual Studio Code by default. But that is all I have to talk about today when it comes to these challenge domains. And if anybody has any particular questions, I would love to answer them.
All right. Thank you very much, Clark. Stuff. Really appreciate it. A lot of good information. Have some comments and questions in chat. I've got one right off the bat. I think that every coder has the top shortcuts that they've memorized and never really want to try anything new. How do you recommend getting yourself up to speed on new techniques that are alien to your toolbox?
I have found that the best way to find these new tools in a box is to reflect on the individual operations you do while programming. Let's say I am navigating files with my mouse, thinking to myself while doing this, if it's an operation that takes more than a second, do I have the tools available to me to solve this? So I would often go to Google and just simply search Visual Studio Code, open file, and see what pops up. And then In this example, we can just go straight to the Visual Studio Code documentation and see what's available. So a lot of reflecting on things that take time and then being conscious of, is this a problem? Is this a navigation problem? And what tools even exist? And then you can experiment them, see if they work for you. And if they don't, then maybe what you have is better already.
I think that's an important point. A lot of coders don't know where the bottlenecks are in their own workflow.
Right.
That's pretty valuable. Puzzles by Joe had a number of comments. Moving to IntelliSense got rid of my need for 90% of my Vim knowledge.
Oh, absolutely. I love IntelliSense. As these tools have evolved over time, we've been able to very quickly just type gesturally what we kind of want the text editor to do, and being able to just fill out the rest of expression just by its knowledge alone.
And Puzzles by Joe brings up another comment, which actually I think shows an interesting delineation between two types of coders I've worked with over the years. One advantage the mouse has is that you can actually keep thinking of your problem while using the mouse, whereas when you text only to jump around and type, it can derail the part of your brain that thinks of the problem solution. I was very anti-mouse back in the day until I realized that property about the mouse. And it's funny because I think most of the coders I've worked with hate having to use the mouse. And they feel that whole searching derails their thought process. What do you think about it as a mouse as a period for contemplation?
I think that really depends. There are some times when a problem's pretty deep technically, where oftentimes I'll find myself just lean back in the chair and use a mouse and put myself in a different mindset, where instead of focusing on jamming as much code onto the screen as possible, I'm now thinking, well, what do I want to do? And once I have that solution in head, you swap to this mentality of, I need to get this on screen as fast as possible. And when I am in the, I know what the solution is, I just need to exist on page right now, then the mouse gets thrown out the window. But when I don't know what the solution is, and that's still processing, then that's the bottleneck in the workflow. The thinking is the bottleneck. But when the thinking is not the bottleneck, then the mouse becomes a cumbersome tool.
Excellent viewpoint. And yeah, I think you're right. It is. There are two types of coders: those who use zeros and those who use ones. No, those who love the mouse and those who hate it. All right. Great presentation today. Really appreciate it. Sorry for that interruption trying to get the next stuff lined up. If you can go ahead and join us in the Voice General channel and anyone in chat who wants to jump in there and continue the conversation. Lots of good techniques, lots of good tips. And I think this is one we could update every year or two to see what new suggestions you have.